This is the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Did everybody have a good Thanksgiving? And it's also the final week of November. And our November focus on thankfulness, the importance of thankfulness as a huge element of our spiritual journey as we mature spiritually. Thankfulness is complicated by a number of factors, one of them being how we perceive the passage of time. So today I want to consider the impact of time by looking back or looking forward and how that impacts our ability to be thankful. We tend to use different words other than thankfulness. When we refer to the future and past, thankfulness for the future we sometimes call hope. And thankfulness for the past we sometimes call nostalgia or sentimentality. The reason this question of thankfulness and time is an important question is that it impacts our experience of God in our spiritual journey, both as individuals and as a church. If we're mostly thankful for the past, for example, we risk spending too much of our time and energy trying to reproduce a past that is likely no longer helpful or fitting. In my experience, God is found mostly in the present moment. And when we experience God, we are usually drawn into the moment by the experience. God is right here and right now in the present. Yet too often we are focused on the past or the present. Maybe more so the past, I don't know. And maybe for good reason. The past holds our birth and the birth of everybody we know. The past may hold for us memories of people we loved who are no longer with us. And those memories are something to be thankful for. And it can be easier to be thankful for the past because we know the past, or at least we think we know the past. There's this level of comfort with the knowledge that whatever happened, we got through it. For these reasons, it can be easier to be thankful for the past than it is for the present moment, and that's okay. As long as it doesn't go too far, as long as looking back does not damage our relationship with God and our relationship with people in the present moment, in the here and now. The past is like a rear view mirror. We need to be able to glance back in our rear view mirror from time to time. But what happens when we get focused, when we get fixated on the rear view mirror instead of focused on the road in front of us right now? We are going to crash. Right? It doesn't work. You can't be fixated on the rear view mirror and function properly. Yet some of us do that to varying degrees. We get fixated on the rear view mirror. And it's easy to do because what lies in our future? We don't know. And that can be unsettling. The future can be scary. So maybe we seek the comfort of the past. But there's a risk in doing that because if we get too obsessed with the rear view mirror, our relationships in the present moment can suffer. When we are overly thankful for the past, overly nostalgic, our relationship with God and with each other can suffer because we're not fully present in the here and now. And a fixation on the past can also cause us to remember history in overly rosy ways, both in our own personal history, what's happened to us, and the history that includes the history we teach our kids in school. We have the habit of telling our histories to ourselves and to our children in a way that leaves out the negative stuff, in a way that glorifies the past. There are a lot of examples of this, including the Thanksgiving holiday itself. Do you know the real history of Thanksgiving? Or do you just know what was taught in public schools, which is the glorified history? The real history of Thanksgiving is more unsettling than what most of us are told in school. And part of the reason I want to talk about the real history of Thanksgiving is that the United Church of Christ, our denomination, includes the Congregationalists, which is the church tradition of American pilgrims. Therefore, the tradition of the Pilgrims is a huge part of us, of our tradition, of the UCC. And to this day, there are many Pilgrim churches, such as the church that I was serving previous to coming here, Pilgrim Church in Lansing. Yep, that's right, partner. I used to call myself a pilgrim. Knowing the real history can help shake us out of an unrealistic longing for the past. And I think it's also worthwhile because it provides a more accurate context for the present moment. The history we're taught in public schools paints an overly rosy and incredibly simplified version of what really happened. For instance, on that first Thanksgiving. Part of the reason is that some people worry that the real history would be too disturbing for kids to hear. In some cases, it maybe is. And part of the reason is that public schools have traditionally been intended to produce people who have an uncritical love of country, a patriotism that focuses just on what we can be proud of. But one downside of holding an overly rosy view of the past is it can have the unintended effect of making us long for the past, the good old days, creating an unhealthy desire to return to an earlier time. Spiritual growth is not about returning to an earlier time. Things are changing, and there have been increased calls for schools to tell the whole story, or a more accurate version of our nation's history. But there's also still considerable resistance to telling the whole story. It's not so easy. Do you remember what we learned in school growing up? Well, I'm going to cover, I can't cover the whole rest of the story, but I'm just going to highlight a few things to remind us of our past in hopefully a more realistic way. The Pilgrims, or the Puritans, were a religious extremists who were rejected by the English religious establishment. So the Pilgrims left England and settled in Holland, where they found the religious freedom that they so desperately wanted. Once they were in Holland, though, something happened. The elders noticed that the younger people were becoming more and more assimilated into the culture and the language. They were becoming Hollanders. They saw their English tradition and culture starting to fade away, and that was unacceptable to them. So that was the reality that drove the Pilgrims to leave the comforts of Holland for the unknowns of a new world in America. Unlike what we're taught, the Pilgrims did not come to America seeking religious freedom, but to preserve their English culture and practices and traditions. They managed to get funding and purchase some really old ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. And then they set sail from Holland, but right away one of the ships, the Speedwell, started taking on water. It had big problems, so they had to head back. They headed back to England. The Speedwell wasn't going to make it, so they dumped a lot of their provisions and they packed everybody from both boats into the Mayflower. They packed everyone in tight into one ship, which was really a formula for disaster. Miraculously, somehow, this overloaded boat with too many people and not enough provisions made it to Massachusetts. They almost landed, but it was November. They were really short on supplies, but they were afraid to risk going to shore. It felt safer staying in the ship, at least until spring. That first winter, the Mayflower turned into a frozen death trap. About half of the Pilgrims would die in the Mayflower before ever touching ground. The next spring, the remaining Pilgrims found a village near the ocean where they happened to land that was deserted. There were fresh graves and many dead Indians who were never buried, who had just died and were left in their tents. See, because a few years before the Pilgrims arrived, a terrible pandemic had swept through that entire area, brought mostly by slave traders. Do you remember how slave traders had a huge impact on the Pilgrims? Something not typically mentioned in our stories we're told in school. The Native Americans had no immunity to European diseases, and an estimated 90% of Native peoples died out between 1616 and 1619, just before the Pilgrims arrived, due to this unintentional spread of disease. Sometimes maybe it wasn't, but mostly unintentional. The Pilgrims called the disease Indian fever, not realizing that European slave traders were actually the primary source of the pandemic. What good fortune, the Pilgrims later wrote. God had prepared a village for them and killed off all the inhabitants so they could live there. It's very unlikely that the Pilgrims would have survived even 1 year if the full Indian population had been alive and healthy. That had no chance. Yet the few Indians that were left nonetheless attacked the small group of Pilgrims. The few who had survived, the slave traders, the few that had immunity to some of these European diseases, and they were in no mood for outsiders, seeing all their families, most of their family and friends being no longer with them. The local Indians had dealt with English slave traders for like 100 years before the Pilgrims arrived. Slave ships for the last 100 years had been landing, killing Indians, and rounding up the rest as slaves. They'd fill their slave ships' hull full of Indians and ship them back to Europe, hoping for great profits. However, most of the Native Americans they captured died in the ships on the way due to disease and harsh treatment by the slave traders. The few that survived became a sensation in Europe, far too valuable to use for work. They were showpieces, circus attractions, a novelty, pets for the wealthy. The Europeans marveled at the independence and abilities of these Indian slaves. Of the Indians abducted by the slave traders, the few who survived the boat trip to Europe learned European languages, and some, a lucky few, very few, actually found passage back home again to return to America. So back to our story. One of those Indians who had returned from England, his name was Squanto. You remember him? He showed up in the village in America that the Pilgrims now occupied. It was his old village. It's where he used to live. Squanto had been abducted years earlier and taken to Europe by slave traders. Squanto was one of those slaves who spent many years in England and had returned to his village. Family and friends who were no longer there, mostly dead to a disease that he recognized from Europe. So Squanto arrives in what's now the Pilgrims' village, speaking the King's English fluently. The Pilgrims are shocked. Squanto is mainly interested in forging an alliance to avoid further death by European weapons and to gain protection from rival tribes. So Squanto taught the Pilgrims, who were by then weakened by malnutrition and illness. He taught them how to grow corn, how to use the sap from maple trees. He taught them how to catch and cook the local fish in the rivers and how to identify the local poisonous plants. Then in November of that first year, 1621, the Pilgrims organized a feast from the harvest that had directly resulted from Squanto's teachings. By then, there were maybe 50 Pilgrims left, and about 90 Indians took part. The few Indians in the area who had developed an immunity to European diseases. And this was a party, this was a feast, this was a celebration. But interestingly, it was not a Thanksgiving. Right? The Pilgrims, from the Pilgrims' perspective, the Pilgrims did not see this party as a Thanksgiving in any way. To the Pilgrims, a Thanksgiving, a true Thanksgiving, would have been a time of fasting and prayer. not a feast. That's not how you thank God, with a party. And certainly not anything that they would have done with a bunch of, as they would have called them, a bunch of godless savages. Because that's how they saw the Indians. But this feast or party nonetheless lasted for 3 days. They had reason to celebrate, and the Indians were a big part of that reason. The Indians had brought them life. And not only that, but enough food for the entire winter, all from native sources. Their European supplies, what little there was, such as sugar, was long gone, so there were no pies, no cakes, or no desserts at this first, what we recognize as the first Thanksgiving. Nonetheless, the peace enabled by Squanto would not last long. Many more English people arrived in large ships, and soon they significantly outnumbered the few remaining Indians. Violence and war broke out between the English and the Indians in what's now called King Philip's War. Did you learn about King Philip's War in school? Most of it did not. It was a terrible and bloody war. Springfield, Massachusetts was burned to the ground, and the Pilgrims killed many of the remaining Indians. The son of the chief who had participated in the first Thanksgiving feast with the Pilgrims was killed, and most of his people were either killed or sold into slavery. About 30% of the English population was killed in that war, along with 50% of the remaining Indians. At the end of the war, King Philip's War, there was another Thanksgiving feast, but this time the Thanksgiving was about defeating the Indians rather than about peace, and no Indians were invited. And that was just the beginning of a series of brutal wars or battles that are barely remembered, rarely told in our histories today. After each battle, there would be another Thanksgiving feast to celebrate. We don't tell the story of Thanksgiving feasts after each of these battles or massacres, but it was a vital part of the story, the actual happenings that established Thanksgiving as a yearly holiday. We don't tell the story of how slavery played an important role in the story either. We don't share the reality that the Pilgrims did not see the Indians as friends or equals, but as godless savages to be taken advantage of, to be used as if they were cattle. It's a heart-wrenching story. When you look at the full picture, this clash of a hunter-gatherer culture with the European agricultural culture. So we prefer to look at the glorified version. I sometimes maybe think I prefer the glorified version too. But there's a big problem with glorifying the past, and that is it has this tendency to distort the present, to make our present reality, which is much less sugar-coated, seem worse. It makes things seem worse today because we don't know how bad things really were back then. We don't have the perspective we need to understand the good things that have occurred. Glorifying the past has the effect of making the present seem less righteous, less virtuous than those earlier days. And I'm not just talking about Thanksgiving, but in general, our tendency to glorify our history. When we don't acknowledge our whole story, it's easy to glorify the past, to see only the birth and not the death, to see only the winning, and never to see how others were hurt, to see only the positive things, and we're particularly good at ignoring slavery. But when we know the whole story, we can look in the rearview mirror and see the past more clearly, and we can see both the good and the bad. About 80% of the Pilgrims experienced an early death due to their decision to leave Holland to preserve their English culture. I'm not trying to throw cold water on Thanksgiving. I just think it's worthwhile for us to be aware of the realities of our human and our American history. Not to make us feel bad or ashamed or guilty, but because we deserve to know the truth. And it can help us to be more realistically thankful for our lives and our families in the here and now. To give us a truer perspective. For one thing, when we are realistic about how things were in the past, things right now will not seem so bad in comparison. With our eyes open, we can look in the rearview mirror and see both the good and bad, and we can look into the future and see both good and bad. And finally, we can look into the present moment. We can look directly into the eyes of God and be thankful for it all. Thankful that we've survived. Thankful that we're here now. We can appreciate the chance we've been given to make this a better world. Not to try to recreate some gilded past, but to live into a new way in a new day, as demonstrated by our best understanding of Jesus Christ's teachings. Our history as a nation and our history of Christians has been long and sometimes rocky. But we're better and stronger when we acknowledge it and are grateful for it, for what it teaches us. So we don't reproduce, so we don't repeat the negative things in our history. Or maybe we do it less often. On this Thanksgiving weekend, more than 3 centuries after those first Thanksgiving feasts in colonial America, we can be thankful both for our history and for our lives now. Grateful for the gift of life in the present and the presence of Jesus Christ now and in the days to come. Amen.